Chapter 50. Could it happen again? In the aftermath of the First World War, in the 1920s and 1930s, the survivors came to look upon that disastrous conflict as a European civil war. To have ignited it was condemned either as a ghastly mistake or as a dreadful crime. The overriding lesson of the catastrophe was deemed to be that humankind never must allow such a thing to happen again. Of course it did happen again when, in 1939–45, the Allies, France, Britain, Russia, and the United States, continued the fight that had not been resolved in 1914–18. But then actual hostilities among the surviving powers, Britain, Russia, and the United States, did not develop when they failed to reach agreement on the peace terms that ought to have ended the two parts of the 1914–45 World War. They turned instead to a war that was cold. In managing the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was haunted by what he believed he had learned from reading about the origins of World War I in Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. He felt that the war had been the result of an unintended chain reaction. The Kennedy generation was educated in the interwar years, at a time when the leading American text, The Origins of the World War by Sidney B. Fay, taught that none of the great powers had wanted a war among themselves. They had been caught up in the Great War nonetheless, for which Austria-Hungary was more responsible than the other countries, although not even Vienna deliberately brought the war about. Similar views were popularized by Tuchman, whose book reached a mass audience. Based on the evidence available in those pre-Fisher times, Fay's teachings seemed to be close to the truth, and even in Europe, leading scholars and politicians arrived at conclusions much like his. In his war memoirs, former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George famously claimed that the nations slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war without a trace of apprehension or dismay. Raymond Aron, one of the greatest political thinkers of the 20th century, saw in the story of July 1914 the unleashing of the First World War which none of the principal actors consciously or directly wished for. The lesson to be learned from the Great War, the world was told, is that governments must be careful not to lose control. They must not let confrontations inadvertently spill over into hostilities. They must not let small wars escalate into big wars. They must not let brush fires blaze into forest fires. These are good lessons to learn, but it is not July 1914 that teaches them. It was no accident that Europe went to war at that time. It was the result of premeditated decisions by two governments. Once those two countries had invaded their neighbors, there was no way for the neighbors to keep the peace. That was true in World War II. At Pearl Harbor, Japan made the war or peace decision not merely for itself, but for the unwilling United States as well, by launching its attack. Nor had America any more choice in Europe in 1941. Hitler's Germany declared war on the United States, to which America was obliged to respond. To repeat, it takes two or more to keep the peace, but only one to start a war. And that means that it could happen again. An aggressor can start a major war even today, and even if other great powers desire to stay at peace, unless other nations are powerful enough to deter it. At least one thing has changed greatly between then and now. In 1914 the coming of war was an almost complete surprise to the public. In the open world of today we would be likely to have at least some sort of advance warning. In turn, that would give peoples and parliaments at least a chance to make their views known. How much of a difference that might make is difficult to foretell.